on a book tour. Where does it take you?
I have come from Canada and Colombia, and I think my next bits are France and Denmark. And then there's others before and others after. So,
do you like it?
Yeah, I do like it. It's great to meet readers from all over the world and to also see how the book resonates with different publics and different approaches. So the new book has 22 translations coming, and so some have already come out, others are still being published. So I think when I'm done with all these and the new ones, I'll retreat into my study and write my new book.
Yeah, the previous book is almost 40 languages now.
37.
37.
Yeah.
How does it feel?
The first book was a real surprise. I did not expect that Albania would resonate so much in so many places, and that people would tell me that my story is their story, even in very different contexts. And I think there must be something about this idea of freedom that it discusses that resonates with a lot of people. And
I'm very glad to be able to talk to you about freedom, especially. But in this latest book, you went in search of your family's history, which means your own history, your identity. You went into different Albanian archives. And identity here is often discussed in terms such as Greek, Albanian, Turk, Christian, Muslim, etc. Were you also searching for some sort of ideological identity? Your own relationship to these fundamental concepts of our political culture, individuality, freedom, democracy?
I think I was trying to understand the complexity of identity. And so I don't think I was searching for one particular way of understanding identity, although I do think that there is an ideological aspect to our identity as well. And sometimes the interesting question is how it connects to family identity, to religious identity, to national identity. And so how this one privileged point of view that we think is ideology intersects with these other ways of thinking about other privileged points of view, like nationalism or religion or gender. But I don't think I was out to look for one way of defining it. In many ways, I think the book is about the complexity of identity and how often there's many people inhabit in one same person, and many different identities are also part of the same and define the same person.
And this is important to you, it seems to me, to pinpoint that the person is very complex, even though our images of the Greek, the Albanian, the Turk, etc. are quite simple.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how our reading of history produces then readings of people. And so how we interpret the person as one thing, because we inherit a certain reading of history as the correct one, perhaps. And so I guess what the book tries to do is to show history from angles that are not the official ones, and to try and tackle the hidden aspects of authority, of archives, of the way in which power constructs identity, and then to shed different light then on what that person is if you take into account of these different sources of history making.
Yeah, very Foucault.
I think there is there's a part of the book where I talk about what an archive is, and that is very much borrowing from Foucault's reading of the archive and in fact I cite Foucault there, where he says that the archive is the historical a priori, and it structures our reading of events in the same way in which grammar structures thought.
I'm also very interested in you as like a socialist thinker, because many people perceive you as coming from the left and dealing with freedom from a leftist perspective. And in your previous book, you let us know that you lecture students at London School of Economics on the thoughts of Karl Marx. And you often start by saying that you believe that Karl Marx is all about material issues, economics, etc., etc. But in your view, socialism, you tell them, is above all a theory of human freedom. Why is that message so important for you to get across?
I think it's important because I tend to think of the socialist tradition as an effort to radicalize the yearning for freedom that is at the heart of the liberal tradition. And it's important for me to see those two projects, liberalism and socialism, as continuous with each other. And to also think in what way does our economic system actually undermine this concern for freedom that is the heart of the liberal tradition. one way of reading the socialist critique of capitalism is as an economic system that restricts freedom for a number of people, and that in fact entrenches certain hierarchies of economic and political power that make it really difficult for some people to have freedom and that give too much freedom to other people.
But when you and I grew up during the Cold War, the ideological perception was different, because on one side you had the United States of America and capitalism and freedom and liberalism also, in the pursuit of happiness, but above all liberty. And on the other hand, you had the Soviet Union and the communists, and this side of the conflict was all about collectivism. So the mindset we grew up with was telling us that liberty and equality are opposites.
Yeah.
And social democracy, seen from Scandinavia, would be like the perfect mix.
Yeah.
Some of this and some of that, and then the perfect balance.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think that the social democratic tradition is actually a result genealogically of the socialist critique of capitalism. And so it's an ideological operation and a sort of ideological misleading that attributes the success of social democracy to liberalism and to capitalism. Because I think historically social democracy emerges from the socialist critique of capitalism, and it's an effort to place limits on capitalism. And to the extent that it's a success story because it has contained capitalism, not because it has enabled it to flourish. And I think likewise, this assimilation of equality to collectivism and this distinction of the free world, the capitalist world is the world that cares about freedom, and the Soviet socialist, state socialist world is the world that cares about equality, is also one way of obscuring how actually freedom is also at the heart of the socialist tradition, and also of obscuring that social democracy is a result of that socialist tradition. So I think the socialist critique of capitalism in the 20th century has two children. One is social democracy, the other is state socialism. Both of them have limitations, they both have their flaws, and there is critique that one can make to both of them. But it's mistaken to think that equality was the only thing that the socialist tradition cares about.
And also there's perhaps a mistake to think that there was all that much equality in the Soviet Union.
Well,
because,
right. Because
the elites were
absolutely exactly.
Elites.
Yeah.
For a professor of political theory such as yourself, is it easy to define and think with concepts such as freedom and democracy?
Well, at one level, it's hard because they're abstract concepts. And so if you speak of them only as abstract concepts, and if you think of them as part of philosophical traditions that seem very difficult and very remote from people's concerns, it might look difficult. But I also think that these ideas make us, and we are the result of traditions that are inspired by these ideas, that our personal histories are the result of macro history. And so in one individual life, you can see the influence on these, not just ideas, but also the negotiation of ideas, the compromises made around ideas, the way in which ideas feature into politics. And in that sense, it's not that hard, because you can really, with one life, with one biography, or with one family history, you can actually explain very complex ideas, or ideas that seem very complex to a lot of people, and you can really see how they play out.
I believe that freedom is perhaps the most important word in the Western political vocabulary, because of the way it has been used, both in the sense of like national sovereignty freedom that we celebrate on our national holidays, like the 17th of May, Independence Day, but even more so perhaps the idea of the individual, the freedom of individuals. And you mentioned that it's possible to think about this within the history of one person's life and family. And this is exactly what you do, because you tell us about, for instance, your mother's conception of freedom, your father's conception of freedom. And we can begin there. What was the way your mother viewed freedom?
Yeah, so in my first book, in Free, there were at least 3 ideas of freedom at play. My mother's one was the one that I actually started criticizing when I said it's the sort of libertarian idea of freedom, which is negative freedom understood as the absence of interference, and a critique of political authority and of the collective in many
So
ways
if I am
as
free,
an obstacle.
If I'm free to make my own choices and do what I want,
yeah,
I'm
like
free.
basically it's freedom to wear what you want, freedom to say what you want, freedom to go wherever you want. And so freedom as understood as the absence of constraint. And this is freedom understood in the classical liberal way, negative freedom. And another idea of freedom, so this is my mother's one, and it's the one that inspires much of the supposed political rights approach to freedom, this freedom as absence of interference and this critique of authority as that which undermines.
Yeah. Could we call it the freedom to play the cards that you were dealt in the manner you see fit? Do I want to be a Christian or a Muslim? Do I want to be gay or not? Do I want to move out of the country, stay here? Those are pretty important freedoms that people have died for.
Yeah, exactly.
So these are like individual liberal rights.
Yeah, individual, political freedoms.
Yeah.
And so this is what people in the human rights discourse called first generation freedoms, the first kind of freedoms that we fought for in modernity. Because
so
this is the other thing, it's a very modern idea as well. If you think about the classics, if you think about ancient Greece, for example, or even Rome, there is a freedom of the collective that works very differently and where the meaningness of individual choices is within this collective understanding. So there's a sense of the freedom of the community that trumps, if you think about Homer and or the Greek classics, where you have this conception of individual freedom is not really there. It's more freedom that's subscribed within a collective freedom. So
I'm glad you specified that because I thought about Homer Simpson first.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, I meant the Iliad and I think there is a sense in which there's, as I say, the choices of the person are tied with the choices of a collective or with the fate of that person that is overdetermined by the intervention of gods or by the intervention of the community. But so I think this individual political freedom, this is a very modern idea.
So when you criticize this definition, it is not because you think it's not important to have these individual liberties and freedoms.
No, I think it's very important. And it's the source of the modern account of legitimation, which is, the political authority gets its legitimacy from a particular connection to individual agency and to individual freedom. And so it's a move away in modern political thought. It's a move away from the divine right of kings, for example. So this idea that rulers rule because they rule in the name of God and we can ask no further questions about that, to an idea that they rule because they respect certain claims of the individuals.
Yeah, they have a freedom of contract, freedom of expression.
Exactly, they are subjected to their authority because this authority gives them certain rights in exchange for certain liberties.
And then there's something else that you link to your father.
Well, so the second one is it is what's called a positive idea of freedom. So that is not the freedom from, but the freedom to. And so there it's more like freedom as equal opportunity. It's a question that asks, what does it mean to have these negative freedoms if you don't have opportunities to do certain things? And so what does it mean, for example, to have freedom of expression if you don't have education and you don't have the tools to express yourself? And so you have to have the freedom to something so that then you can have the freedom from something. And I think it's a very important one because that is at the heart of a tradition that is the second generation way of thinking about human rights, for example, where it's not just political rights, but it's also social rights. And that's also at the heart of much thinking that is preoccupied by this question of how do I think about the conditions for a meaningful exercise of negative freedom. And that takes you into a more social dimension that you open up to the community.
I always thought that this was a weird idea because I am all in favor of social rights. I think that education should be a right, that food shouldn't be a commodity like any other. I mean, if people need food in order not to starve to death, they should have a right. And freedom from pollution, you could talk about that. But to me, these are all different definitions of social security or a good life or a healthy environment. And I don't think putting the label freedom on them turn them into instances of freedom. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think I disagree with that, but that's because I have an even further understanding of freedom that's neither the first nor the second, which is about asking the question of what does it mean to be an agent? What does it mean to be someone who acts in a certain way? And what does it mean to make certain choices? So what are the background conditions under which we make certain choices? And this takes you to a dimension of freedom that I think is deeper than either the first or the second. And that's actually the one that my grandmother has in the first book, but that she continues to have also in the second book. And that's the idea of freedom that I subscribe to, which is that actually, freedom is really something that is always there with us, and it's the freedom that is revealed to us in the moment of moral responsibility. So it's freedom connected to moral agency, to choices made within certain constraints that are rational constraints on choice, and as reflections of a certain way of thinking about the human will.
Can you give us an example?
So I think if you ask yourself, for example, what is the distinction between a human and an animal? And you say both of them are natural species. So we want to eat, to drink, to sleep, to relax, and we have certain natural functions. But then humans have something else. They have something that we call reflexivity. So they can also ask themselves, what is the point of eating and drinking and sleeping? And because they can ask this question, they can also decide not to follow these instincts, not to follow these inclinations. So a human being, unlike an animal, when they're hungry, they eat. A human being can decide, for example, to go on a hunger strike. So not to eat in the name of a higher principle. So this is something that's a background condition under which we make choices. And there is a moral structure to what underpins those choices. And I think this is where we really see this moral freedom. This is where we see our capacity to do this is what reveals to us that we are ultimately not completely dependent on nature, that we have this capacity to stand back from these natural instincts and inclinations and to ask ourselves, is this reasonable or is it not reasonable? Should I do it or should I not do it? And this reflexivity is what grounds this idea of moral freedom that I'm talking about.
So the free individual will be the person who is able to have an idea of what it would be moral and also to do the morally correct thing.
Right, so now there's two, this is now it gets a little bit more complicated. Being a person as opposed to an animal means that you already have this. So we have this capacity to ask ourselves, is this reasonable, is it not reasonable? We have this capacity to ask, to see the problem when we follow our instincts and we don't do the kind of thing that we think we should have done because we decide to ignore what the right thing to do is and to just follow our inclinations. But now there's an internal dimension to freedom that is this thinking about what is the right thing to do. And then there's an external dimension which is doing it. So you can think about what the right thing to do is, but you may not be able to do it because of the circumstances in which your choice is connected with the choices of other people. And in many ways, actually, my second book, Indignity, is a lot about exactly that. It's about a character, like my grandmother, who in the first book has this moral conception of freedom. So she has this idea that freedom is moral agency.
Yeah, because even when she is quite heavily oppressed by the communist dictatorship in Albania, her husband is sent to jail for over a decade, 15 years, for political opposition. And her life is like taken away from her. Yeah. When you ask her about freedom, she says she has felt
always free.
I was always free because she was able to make her own choices in the situation according to her own standards.
Or at least, I mean, this is where it's tested in the book, right? So the whole point of the book is in a way to just put pressure on that idea of freedom, because I think a good work of literature shouldn't just, propagate an idea. It should also show the readers in many ways the limitations of that idea, or it should raise doubts about it, and it should test it. And that's exactly her conception of freedom. That's exactly where it's tested. So I would say it's not that she always makes the right choices. She thinks she's making the right choices. She tries to make the right choices. And often this results into resisting the very compromising things that she might be doing instead. So when she decides, for example, that she's not going to be a collaborator, so she gets summoned to the Secret Service. I say in the book at some point that every so often she would get called in these party offices with an offer to become an informant. And she refuses to become an informant. And
this is the Albanian equivalent to the Securitate.
To the Securitate, Romania, exactly. So this is one dimension in which you can see that someone's moral freedom does make a difference, because she doesn't feel, oh, I have no choice, I have to become an informant. She refuses this and she pays the cost for it. There is a consequence, and it's not a nice consequence. She doesn't have a happy life. So the other really interesting thing about this idea of freedom is that it's not connected to happiness. It's more connected to virtue. And it's a way of teasing out that or unpacking the implications of this conception by saying, being free isn't necessarily being happy. And sometimes happiness comes, sometimes it doesn't come, but it's not a condition that to do your duty is to do whatever makes you happy. It's more connected to virtue, and that's something else.
So this virtuous perception of liberty, is it akin to the idea of freedom as having insight into necessity? that Friedrich Engels mentioned somewhere. Just to know what necessity. It's not freedom from necessity or constraints. It's having the insight in what they are and then acting to the best of your ability.
Yeah, exactly. There is a sense of I suppose, an understanding of a rational necessity. So the rational necessity, this idea of duty. And a duty is something that binds you, but the binding comes from yourself. And so there is necessity, but it's rational. It's not the necessity of nature, because nature is also creating a whole series of necessities. As we said earlier, these physical needs that we have and the urge to satisfy them. That's also necessity. But there is a conception of freedom that is awareness of responsibility understood as rational necessity. And that's a slightly different conception.
But there are different kinds of unfreedoms and constraints. You have the natural ones and you have the social.
Yeah.
So the natural will be you cannot fly like a bird.
Yeah.
You have to walk the earth.
Right.
You don't scream about injustice and unfreedom because of this. But if your wages are very low at the Tesla factory in Berlin and they are screwing the workers and their conditions, and you have 3 times as many ambulances going out to the Tesla factory as the typical German factory, you could talk about the social injustice that could have been different. Yeah. And the idea of oppression and liberation comes into play because these are not the natural constraints.
Yeah.
So when you talk about humans, you distinguish them very much from the other animals. And you think about the human capacity for instance, not eating as a very human thing, whereas animals, or the other animals, are very instinctual. Are you sure about this? I mean, the lion mother, the cat, the monkey, someone who gives up her own food for someone else, they will... in my mind, the chimpanzee can make a choice. If I'm not the alpha male or I'm not the leader of the pack, I can choose whether I attack and try to become the leader.
So this is
not. They make choices.
Sure, So this is a conceptual distinction about the difference between reason and not reason. But that doesn't mean that, there is an evolution. And so, of course, there are species that could be closer to having those capacities and other species that could be further away from it. But the conceptual distinction is what matters here, is this connection to reflexivity and the fact that humans are the ones that have developed this to its highest potential and have this capacity. And that's why it becomes even more tragic when then the societies that we construct don't reflect these capacities because of other things trumping this rational necessity that we might have.
So it's very René Descartes in this sense that the thinking part of the human is what defines it for you.
Right, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's this capacity for reflexivity, and I think this grounds a certain understanding of freedom that is more robust than an understanding of freedom that you might get if you just think about satisfaction of impulses, for example.
There's something else here which is called Republican tradition. What is that?
Yeah, I think there is something along the lines of a reconciliation between the positive and the negative idea of freedom. And so in the Republican tradition, they are combined in this understanding of freedom as absence of domination. And the idea is that freedom as non-domination reconciles the concerns that the social critiques of negative freedom bring, and that it gives you an account of what does it mean to live in a community where you then have non-dominating structures through which then you get to a certain understanding of individual agency. I don't think they're incompatible with my account. It's more that I think of this as the freedom as non-domination as the political ideal that results from this understanding of freedom as moral agency. And so it's more like this is a horizon within which we try to create institutions. And I don't think, perhaps one of my criticisms of the Republican tradition is that they think that the Republic or the state or some existing political community or some model of political community that we know realizes this conception of non-domination. And I'm a little bit more skeptical that any institution that we have known historically really embodies this conception of non-domination. But I think I like it as a political ideal, and I think it's very close to when I think about the political realization of this conception of moral agency that I have in mind. It's very much an ideal of a world that is also free from domination.
The way I have perceived this Republican tradition is that it is very much in contrast to what has become the liberal idea of freedom that you described, which was the freedom from constraint or impediments, which means really the freedom from the law or violence.
Yeah.
Because the classical example would be 17th century England and the parliament struggling against the crown, where the king would say, I may be a dictator, but I'm very benevolent. I will not interfere with my subjects. And the freedom-fighting parliament says, well, we are still slaves. Because just living in fear of your meddling in our business creates self-censorship. You can see this also in the reality show of The Apprentice. Donald Trump used to have a big reality show. Now he has an even bigger one. But in The Apprentice, he would just say, you're fired. And you could see from these people what mode of human existence comes out of living at the mercy of the dictator. So even when he wasn't interfering, they were licking his boots.
Exactly. And I think, so what's at the heart of this idea of Republican non-domination is exactly this, the problems posed by a world of power hierarchies and power asymmetries. And I think there is also a very interesting critique of capitalism that emerges from that as well, which is insofar as you have an economic system that is premised on the asymmetry between the owners of the means of production on the one hand, the people who have to sell their labor power on the other, and there is this asymmetry from the start. The labor is divided in such a way and profit is made based on these hierarchies, then you are always at the mercy. You can have a nice capitalist as an owner, but you're always at the mercy of the fluctuations of the market or of competition or of making certain choices and the implications of those choices for then the lives who are much more vulnerable. And so it's an interesting, a bit like with the parliament and the state and the crown, you can have the same thing when it comes to, for example, discussions around ethical business or ethical consumerism or the nice employer, the nice capitalist, and how there the problem is not the particular individual who might be nice, but it's a system that is structurally constructed in such a way as to hinder freedom.
Yeah, but before we get to this proletarian struggle in the factory, I think it's worth noticing, the strength of the Republican side in the 17th century, arguing against the idea of the benevolent king, because I think it's such a good point. They say that, well, unless we are allowed to write the laws under which we have to live our lives, we will be slaves or we will be subservient. And we are always dependent upon the goodwill of the master, which I believe must be the situation in communist Albania, where you could have a very good communist party doing all the right things, but still as long as it's the only party and opposition is sometimes crushed violently, everyone will be living in fear. So it can be good in many ways, but it's not freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that, definitely. And that's why it's also, in a way, this is why I think the best way to think this idea of freedom as non-domination is as a synthesis of the first generation and the second generation. So this idea that actually it really matters to have political freedom and to have certain realms in which you can make your own decisions.
I think one strength that they have here is that they point to how the unfreedom and the oppression can be silent.
Yeah.
The ruler doesn't have to do anything.
Yeah.
And the fact that he didn't cut off anyone's head today doesn't mean that everyone is free today. And I think this is probably what you're after with capitalism. That in Capital, Karl Marx mentioned what he called the mute or silent compulsion of economic circumstance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which is that you don't have to enclose the commons. You don't have to put a gun to the head of the worker. They are compelled, as it were, to a complicity in their own.
When things go well for capital, when things go well, you don't have to do that. But when things go badly, you can see that you also have to do that. So this is the other really interesting thing. So that capitalism, at its best, is mute compulsion, but in moments of crisis, in times of crisis, it is also murder and colonial violence and exploitation of a naked form. So it's really interesting that because of, I suppose, where that criticism is getting at is that in the best case scenario, capitalism is a system that is oriented towards the accumulation of profit. And because of the profit motive that subordinates everything else, it means that capital has certain embedded imperatives and a kind of logic that the system entrenches and that forces you to reflect and to react in this way. But of course, when there is a crisis, when there are moments of, you can really see that in the kind of struggle for competition for resources or in the struggle for access to markets, where then it also leads to war and to imperialism and to colonial violence.
But this liberal tradition that you're sort of fighting against, at the same time you want to preserve what's good, the struggle for individual liberties, civil liberties, all of that. In my mind, it had a very interesting about face, or it turned like 180 degrees when this parliament eventually, this bourgeois class of intellectuals and businessmen are granted political rights. They have said that we will be slaves unless we are allowed to write the laws. At the same time that they get this, they decide that this freedom will not be for the women, it will not be for the servants, it will not be for the workers, because they are lesser people. So they deserve lesser freedoms. They will have the freedom to play their cards as they see fit, but they will not have the freedom, the higher human freedom to write the rules. So liberalism, in my mind, was like this apartheid system where the higher-ups will be writing the rules through democracy, and the majority would not be allowed the freedom to vote.
So I think this is a very interesting question. I wonder whether it's more liberalism there or it's more capitalism. So there is a kind of philosophical way of understanding liberalism, which is about the modern subject, and this, what we've just been talking about, this idea of reason and rationality and what is a modern subject, and that is a philosophical discussion. And then there's a kind of historical discussion of who were the groups, and sociological discussion of who are the groups that were actually campaigning on behalf of that idea. And there, I don't think that at some point they decide, oh, now we're going to cut women out, or now we're going to cut the workers. They were never part of the movement. So when the bourgeoisie emerges as a social class, and it emerges as a political subject, it emerges in response to the aristocracy, in response to the crown. And so it's a group of people that has a narrative of individual freedom, but it's always this group of people that advocates, it's this particular class that advocates on behalf of this idea of freedom.
Thomas Jefferson, he said that all men are created equal, but also that American women are too wise to wrinkle their foreheads with politics.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I think, so it's only, in the French Revolution, you see this a little bit with Olympe de Gouges, and so with these very, very early feminists who say, what is this Déclaration des droits de l'homme, and why is it just les droits de l'homme, why is it just the rights of men and not the rights of women? Because clearly the rhetoric has been of a universal kind, but the political subject that carries over that rhetoric is at that point is property-owning men.
Yeah,
basically.
it's like the... I think Losordo calls it the brotherhood of liberal men.
Right, exactly.
So not the women, not the blacks, not the workers, none of them.
Yeah, so this was the class that was sort of advocate. And this is why I think some of the Marxist critique of liberalism takes the form of saying, okay, let's think about who is the really universal class here. And so what is the class on behalf of which you can really advocate for the freedom of humans as opposed to just the freedoms of this human or that human. And he thinks that it's the working classes because of their particular social positioning in this economic conflict. So but I think there is this tension.
If two people are to be free together, sort of, if you imagine like Elon Musk or some capitalist on the one hand, who's on one side of this divide in our society, and some worker, one of the women who are cleaning his factory on the other hand. And in the liberal sense, they are both free. They're free to engage in contracts. They even they are free to move out of the country. They are free in our time even to vote in elections. She has one vote. He has one vote. But for you, there's not enough freedom here. So what does it take for her and him to equally be free? What is the preconditions of liberty?
I suppose it's going beyond this idea of contractual relations and this idea of that reduces freedom to just the surface in a way. So this unpacking of what does this freedom actually mean, and the premise that says Elon Musk is there and he has certain privileges because he has deserved his wealth. and he has deserved his wealth because he has, in the best case scenario, created it out of hard work and out of labor and, out of using situations to his own advantage, being cunning, having certain skills. All of this is what the liberal story of freedom tells you. Someone who works hard, improves on something, creates a product, then they can do whatever they want. And so
this is a moral tale of deserved privilege.
Well, it's a moral tale of privilege. If you ask yourself the first question, which is what is the world in which he interacts, with which he interacts. So if you ask yourself the question of the first acquisition, because everything follows about property, if you say the first owner or the first person who works on this deserves it, or where does the first property comes from? And then this is very, in philosophy, the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick talks about this. So he says, I have the common, I have the person who is working on the common and creates private property, and then this network of private property then creates a capitalist system, and then everything that follows from just transactions is just. And so then someone who interferes on that and goes to the rich person and says, now I'm going to take your property, Nozick says this is like stealing, because he's created something, and it is a violation of freedom. But if you ask yourself, well, how did you get that right to the first thing in the first place? And this logic, which is this individual freedom logic that is about the person and the world, and doesn't ask itself the relational question, which is in the moment the first person or the first owner or the first property owner who establishes his claim on the world, what they're actually doing, they're removing it from the commons. They're making it unavailable to everyone else. So the worker who would have liked to do the same thing had no possibility of doing it because they came to a world that was already created with this hierarchy and with this private property structure. That is coercive.
But this sounds like an argument over justice and fairness, whether or not.
I personally think it's not. I think it's not an argument about justice. I think it's an argument about freedom. If you understand freedom in this relational way.
So let's think about this. If you just we forget about capitalism then. So we say that there's something called a car factory, and it has to do certain things in order for us to get electric vehicles, and you have someone managing it, like Elon says he is, and someone working there. And we want them to do this under conditions of freedom. I guess that must mean that everyone here has dignity in a certain sense. Your book is about dignity, the later one. So it's interesting to see how that may come about. But also, if you are to believe the Republican tradition, the workers here, they have to write the laws under which they are working somehow. They have to have a say of some kind. There has to be some kind of democratic freedom in the picture. Or is that only at the state level? No.
So I think there's two models here of like politics, right? So the one that says the workers have their say by being in a liberal system where they vote, for example. And so why should the worker have a say in the company? So this would be the standard liberal story. They would say to you, they work under these conditions, but they sign a contract. And in having signed their contract, they sign it freely. And so that is where they express their freedom. So then, of course, they subject themselves to the will of Elon Musk, but they're not really subjecting themselves to the will of Elon Musk or to whatever car factory owner. They are signing a contract, right?
Outside the factory, they live in freedom. Inside the factory door, they live in Elon's dictatorship.
Because they've signed up, exactly. And so if you take freedom to be just the freedom of this kind of contractual relation that we enter freely into, then whatever is signed in the contract is an instantiation of freedom. But if you ask yourself the structural question of why do we have people who own the means of production and people who have to sell their labor for a living? And is there another way of organizing social relations where you don't have this asymmetry entrenched in our economic system? And wouldn't that world be a world that is actually more rigorous in realizing freedom than a world that forces people into these positions from the get-go? Because either you're born into the family of a property-owning class or you're born into having to sell your labor for a living, and there's not really anything else. That is the kind of structural question. And that's one that goes beyond, and it's a structural question and it's a relational question, and it's one that goes beyond this idea of freedom understood as just contractual relations and what do individuals sign with each other.
In New York City, like 200 years ago, I think the workers were onto this. So they would say things like, there is to be a people in industry as there is in the Republic.
Right.
So the will of the people was a concept also in work life. So you would translate that probably to you will elect the boss.
Right.
In the University of Oslo, that's how they do it. They elect the headmaster.
Right.
And you would elect the boss here, and you would have a democratic economy, which I presume is like the democratic socialist answer to these questions. Why is there more freedom in that system? I can understand why there's more equality. Of course, if everyone has a say. Also in work life, where we spend a lot of our more active parts of our day in our lives. It's a very important part of our day in our lives. It's more just in one sense. It's more democratic. How is it also a higher form of freedom?
Because there is more agency. And so there is a way in which you can express your humanity better in this system than in one where you have this asymmetry. And so a society that is democratic through and through in its economic structures, in its political structures, realizes this human potential that we all have, this moral freedom that I've just been talking about, in a more radical and in a more robust and in a kind of counterfactually more robust way than the one that just takes it at the surface level and says it's just political freedom, for example. So a society where you have... I'm a little bit reluctant to talk about republicanism because I think this is really at the heart of the democratic tradition. And I think what is going there is a very sort of very hardcore radical democratic instinct that says that you need to democratize all aspects of life. And so you can't keep democratization just to the political. There is something to economic democracy and there is something to a society that doesn't entrench economic roles by being premised on this distinction between the owners and the workers. So if you have these fluid boundaries between who owns and who works, and they're both, on the one hand, you have the people who have capital, but also work, and the people who work, but they also run the company. This is a much more radical and more robust realization of your freedom than a system. And so it's not really about equality. I think equality comes in, but it's a sort of later step. I think it's, for me, much more connected to this question of moral freedom.
This is the exact opposite of the thought of thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who were at the core of what's been called neoliberalism. Because Hayek's great concern was that democracy and the freedom of individuals to take part in writing the rules of the game through parliaments and the labor movement and mass democracy would kill real freedom, which to him was this lower kind of freedom to play the cards you were dealt as you see fit, what we could call economic freedom. So the freedom of the investor to place his billions as he please, the freedom of the janitor to quit his job if he so chooses. And there was this tension between freedom and democracy in Hayek. They are very afraid of mass democracy, stupid democracy. It looks like communism democracy to them. How does that polarity look from your vantage point?
I think the Hayek conception of freedom is the more superficial one. And so it's the one that is just freedom as absence of constraint. And if you have that conception of freedom as absence of constraint, if you don't ask yourself what is the justification for the social world in which this conception of freedom is emerging, then I think you can't then ask the fundamental question of why is a janitor, why is a business person. It's basically, you don't ask yourself a question of why are we in social roles, the kind of social role that we occupy. How do this social role emerge? What is the social structure that leaks and entrenches those roles, and that also entrenches the power asymmetries that come with the inhabiting of these different social roles? So for me, that's the first question about freedom, is this very superficial question of absence of constraint. But then there's a deeper question about, well, where does this world of constraint come from? And that's the more philosophical question, I think, is answered if you start from a slightly different perspective on social relations than the one that starts with the individual and then justifies the world, as opposed to if you start with a kind of shared world and then you think, what is the role that individuals ought to occupy in that?
I think it's also 180 degrees opposite in the sense that what you describe sounds to me like freedom through democracy.
Right.
It is a social liberation of women, of workers, of oppressed groups or dominated groups through the use of the ballot box and through exercising that part of our individual freedom, which is democratic freedom.
Exactly. And I think
and Hayek's project is freedom from democracy. The freedom of the economically dominant to exploit their upper hand. And the freedom from restraint here means the freedom from democracy, because democracy, especially here in Northern Europe, goes after the rich and starts constraining their ability to abuse their economic powers. Yeah. So what they call liberation, we call, or they want to liberate themselves from what we call liberation through democracy.
Right. Well, but I also think it's because I think the democratic project is a project of freedom to come, in a way. So there's an idea of, we have this moral understanding of the person, and then there's a political project, and there's a political world in which these moral demands need to be inscribed. And so full political freedom actually comes after you've democratized. And it's very much an unfinished project. So democracy is the effort of creating those political structures that then liberate the individual. So it may well be that in some future utopia, the kind of society that you end up with is a society actually not that far from the Hayek one in terms of spontaneous coordination and sort of, you don't have hierarchies and you don't have authority. But this is a project that is one that is a question of design. It's not something that you start from.
And also there's some sort of ideological chimera in the Hayek or Milton Friedman worldview, because when they gaze upon the world and want freedom, what they see are not individuals. They see companies with their masters of capital owning and running those companies, and they must be free. They see very often families with their household heads. They even see biological and cultural races that are in hierarchies. So it's like that.
But you could have a right-wing critique of that. You know, if you're a libertarian, of a Hayekian libertarian, you could actually say, that's not my world. That's not my idea of freedom. I would like to have something else. It's, Hayek there isn't necessarily racism that pervades or sexism that pervades the conception of freedom. This is why I think it's really important to get it philosophically right from the start and to explain what the difference is already at this level, because I think you could have, I know many libertarians who don't like monopolies. They don't like the kind of capitalist market that we now have. And they have an ideal market society that isn't the market society that we have.
But the happiest day of all of Friedrich Hayek's life was when he got to meet the Queen, Elizabeth. So this freedom fighter for individuals, he was besotted by this most archaic and hierarchical and the nobility. Okay, let's move back to Albania a little bit. The relationship between democracy and capitalism we have discussed a little bit now. You see a democracy as something that needs to overcome capitalism? Yeah,
I think democracy and capitalism are not compatible. So the more capitalism you have, the less you have democracy. Yeah. The more democracy you have, the more you try and get rid of capitalist structures.
So if we take, let's take 4 different societies and try to place them on a continuum from less to more socialism. So we have or 3 countries, that's enough. Albania, under communist dictatorship, one party, not a lot of free trade unions, not a lot of expression of freedom, but a social state, a responsibility, and almost like an old noble type of responsibility to the people from the Communist Party. They didn't just, they felt responsible. It's the way I perceive it. So this is like the minds that what we can perceive from here as East Bloc communism. Then there's the United States of America with its liberal American freedom and capitalism. And then there's social democratic Norway and Sweden. So if we look at these societies, when you grew up maybe, or like in 1990, around the fall of communism, where are they on like if you want to, where's there more socialism and more freedom?
So I'm not a consequentialist, which is why I'm not a utilitarian. And so I don't do this kind of maximum minimum, because for me, what's important is what we can learn from each of these experiences in thinking about the future society that we want to construct. So I don't really engage in this kind of comparative metric, because I think Albania was very far when it came to political freedom, for example. And so this suppression of dissent, of freedom of speech, freedom of manifestation, freedom of movement.